Thanks for joining us today. I have Kendall Miller and Lance Smith presenting on the topic. Lance is one of our engineering managers who's helped many of our clients move from Heroku to Kubernetes. And Kendall is our president and has met with those clients beforehand to answer their questions and help them understand what a typical migration looks like. So today we'll be addressing some of those questions, but if you have any specific ones of your own, feel free to use the Zoom Q&A feature, and I'll get those answered as soon as possible. With that, I'll turn it over to Kendall.
Yeah, so real quick, at a high level, Fairwinds is a company. We've been around about 5 years. We have noticed that in the market, everybody's moving towards Kubernetes, and the vast majority of companies have no idea how to get started with that, where to go. A lot of them go out and hire 5, 6 engineers, spend 6 months trying to get things up and running, and in 6 months have 1 or 2 services running poorly. Or they hire us, and we do that very well, very quickly. We have a ton of automation around that. It is vanilla Kubernetes that we build for clients. That's some of the context for how we're coming at this today. Focus on getting our clients' best practices up and running in Kubernetes so that they can focus on growing their business. So that's what Fairwinds does. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, but just at a high level, we are a Kubernetes enablement company. And we do migrations from Heroku to Kubernetes with some regularity. Lance is in the middle of one of those for one of his team's clients right now. And we're going to go ahead and dive in, and this will be relatively conversational. I'll be asking questions of Lance as one of our team leads about what this process has looked like in the past, what kinds of things we run into regularly and see as common problems. But do please feel free to pipe up if you have questions. So this is our agenda. What's hard about saying goodbye to Heroku? What options to consider as you leave? What to look out for when making a similar move? So there's a lot of things here that are specifically applicable to Heroku to Kubernetes, but there are a lot of PaaSes that you could be migrating off of that are similar to Heroku. There are also other places to go besides Kubernetes, and this will give you some high level of where those things fit. And to be clear, this is going to be a very high level discussion about the things to consider. We're not getting very deep into the technical nitty gritty, although there will be some of that. How we have migrated clients to Kubernetes, and that is, some of our opinions around what works and what doesn't. And then finally, it's a question that we get a lot. How do I move from Heroku and still keep the same great experience? Part of the context for that question is, Heroku is a pretty great place to be. There's a lot of things about running your infrastructure on Heroku that just make sense. And a lot of times clients come to us and say, hey, should we be using Kubernetes? And I often say, if the spend is a problem or the level of complexity is a problem, that's when it makes sense to move off. But honestly, if Heroku is meeting your needs and you can afford it, there's a lot of wonderful things about staying on that platform. It makes a lot of things easy. And so, first of all, why is it hard to move off of Heroku? There's some simple things here, but let's dive into some of that. So Lance, what kinds of things will companies be giving up in a migration from Heroku to Kubernetes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you give up some level of control and control in process on how you manage resources. As a PaaS, you are able to there's easy to use toggles. There's a full-blown UI that Heroku provides folks. So in Kubernetes by default, when you set it up, it is a infrastructure tool. It's a scheduler of processes, but there's no UI. Now, if you go with one of the managed Kubernetes providers like GKE, AKS, EKS, you get some of that through the web console, but it's still not nearly as robust as what Heroku provides as a PaaS.
There's a lot of opinions in Heroku that you have to then force all your applications into, but if you agree with those opinions and you can bend to those opinions, it is a highly opinionated, it's almost like a gated community. You can't decide to cut down all the trees in your backyard, pour gasoline on them, and light them on fire. I have a friend who tried to do that in a gated community and got in a lot of trouble. There's more limitations on what you can do, but as a result, what you get out of that is a lot of pretty trees in a neighborhood where you can't just cut them down and light them on fire. So everybody's house looks the same, and it can be pretty and well maintained. So there's some of that. So Lance, talk a little bit about that. I mean, Heroku has a lot of specific tools that make deploying into Heroku easy. And once it's deployed into Heroku, you don't have to worry about it. What are the same kinds of tools that could be used, or what are the tools that we're giving up in a migration from Heroku to something like Kubernetes?
Sure. Heroku provides a lot of things for, like, they'll manage your web proxy for you, right? And so you have configs and you have ways that you can click through the UI and set up, what passenger might look like. And, it will manage Nginx configs and routing and stuff for you, as well as manage processes or actually firing up your app on the back end. And there are rough equivalents to that in Kubernetes, which really, in many cases for folks, can be a lot less opinionated, but that means a little bit more malleable to your needs. Of course, there's a learning curve that you have to assume to jump off of, Heroku says, hey, here's how you do this thing, versus when you get into Kubernetes and you start working with add-ons, things like ingress controllers, for example, where it says, like, hey, there's a lot of things that you can do here. You choose your own adventure.
Yeah, so to back to my previous analogy, you've moved into a neighborhood with no HOA, and suddenly you can do anything you want. And for some people, that's a lot of fun, but that also means you can do anything you want. And if you light all those trees on fire in your backyard, you might burn down your house if you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah. If you want to take the wheels off your Camaro and leave it on your front lawn, you are entitled to do that. People may not look at you the same way, but you can certainly do it if you want.
That's right. Okay, so talk a little bit about the specific things that Heroku does just solve for you. You mentioned a few of them. Can you give a little bit longer list? What are the things that Heroku just does and solves that you have to think about in Kubernetes, and it's a little more complicated?
A little bit more. I mean, it sort of gives you a single pane for managing, like, application runtime configs. One great thing that I think Heroku does, and we can talk a little bit more about this when we talk about positioning for migrating off, if that's something that folks choose to do. But it gives you a single pane for config management, and it encourages people to use development practices that incorporate 12-factor app style environment variable driven config for application runtimes, right? But it gives you an easy way to sort of control and make changes and test out different application configs, and you can do all that through the UI. It gives you kind of the ability to deploy both through the UI and through the command line directly from a Git repository. So what it uses is it uses remotes and the idea of creating sort of two push points, both, GitHub, for example, and then a separate remote version of your repository that it can trigger code changes in your application through various environments as you start to move code downstream into production if you're, at a company who's leveraging Heroku and serving production traffic off of it. So it provides some of these, again, highly opinionated ways to do things like do deploys, manage config, manage web proxy stuff.
Yep. Okay. And then in moving off of Heroku, a lot of people do choose that because they want more flexibility. Heroku is that gated community, and gated community works great for a lot of people. At some point, they reach a level of complexity where they need the ability to tweak some levers that Heroku does not allow, and that's a big part of the reason people move off. So I think we've already touched a little bit on the flexibility. Talk about security and compliance. What does Heroku make easy that, in that perspective, that you have to worry a little bit more about Kubernetes doing right?
Sure. Yeah. So Kubernetes will, Heroku is able to offer some sort of guarantee around certain compliance specifications, right? So it's more of a checkbox of, like, hey, we'll enable or disable features that will allow you to meet PCI, for example, and you can do that just by checking this box. And, they have some sort of policy behind the stuff that they do that guarantees that, if you get audited, then you can say, yeah, we're on Heroku and we checked the box. And ideally, whoever your auditors are should be able to either find the documentation or just know, because they do that sort of thing, that Heroku, is compliant if you have the right configs in place. When you get onto Kubernetes, again, there's the opportunity for you to be able to build out all of those specs yourself. However, it's more than just a button click in order to do so.
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot more, the gated community is going to provide some of that security up at the gate. And when you move out of the gated community, you have to make sure that you're moving into a neighborhood that you trust, with neighbors you trust, and that you're putting up the safeguards that you need. So say a company has decided they want to move off to Heroku. What kinds of things should they consider next? This is a tweet from Kelsey Hightower, who's a well-known engineer at Google that talks regularly about these topics. He says, I'm convinced the majority of people managing infrastructure just want a PaaS. The only requirement, it has to be a PaaS they built themselves, right? And so this is kind of what's interesting about Kubernetes is there's a lot of tools out there that'll help you go and build something that's essentially like a Heroku, but specifically tailored to meet your needs. And I think Kubernetes in particular is sort of a PaaS builder if used correctly. To give a little bit of background on this, when Fairwinds started as a company back in, 2015, the first thing we did was go out and build a whole platform for managing infrastructure. We wrote a whole bunch of essentially frameworked code so that we could deploy things in a repeatable way to make sort of PaaS builder. And it was not very long after we got started as a company that Kubernetes was really starting to make waves in the market. And we found that Kubernetes is much better as a base for this and has the community support to make it really useful. But that's one way that you can think about a migration to Kubernetes. There's lots of places you can go. There are other PaaSes, but in the realm of everyone wants a PaaS that they built themselves, Kubernetes gives you the flexibility to get started with something and really tweak it to meet your needs. So let's talk about some of that, Lance. I've covered a few things. Talk about why would a company move from Heroku to Kubernetes? You're working with one right now, maybe. Why are they interested in moving?
Yeah, probably the thing that we see the most is cost. There is certainly a long period of time, I think, for companies from inception, into full-fledged product, where you're serving little enough traffic. It doesn't necessarily make sense to have the expertise in-house to be doing lots of infrastructure things, to be building out your platforms in a cloud provider like Google or Amazon. And Heroku makes a lot of sense. You need to move really, really quickly in the early stage of your company. You're not serving the traffic. You don't need a ton of resource behind what you're doing. And Heroku makes a lot of sense because in that case, when you just need a little bit of resource in order to get up and running, Heroku can be very, very inexpensive. And what most people find is as companies start to grow, as you start to see success as a product, you start to see your infrastructure grow as well. And as that starts to occur, the cost gets higher and higher. And, one of the parts of all the niceties that we just talked about of having a full-blown PaaS like Heroku is that there's a cost associated with them. And at some point you hit an inflection where it makes more sense to start bringing some expertise in-house. It makes more sense to start building some of this stuff on your own from a cost standpoint than it does to continue to pay the premium that you have to pay for staying on a full-blown PaaS. The other piece is what you brought up earlier, Kendall, is the idea of, it is highly opinionated, and there are certain things that Heroku does really, really well, and there's things that options that just aren't provided. There's also some rough edges around, hey, when we get to this point and we're seeing this issue, how do I debug this? And, if you don't have full control over your infrastructure to be able to get in and check things out, mess around things, maybe change things, you could run into some issues where there's a problem that you have, and you have to go through the channel of the PaaS, the third party, in order to be able to get a result.
Sure. Yeah, and I think, to go back over a little bit of sometimes it doesn't make sense. If your Heroku bill is small enough, If it's solving your company's needs, never ever leave Heroku or another PaaS if you happen to be on another PaaS. Like, there's a lot of reasons. If it's affordable for you and it's solving the problem, just don't leave. It's made a lot of life easy. And even as a company that focuses on Kubernetes and tells everyone to move to Kubernetes, we will tell you in some of those situations, just stay put. If Heroku's solving your problem, it's the right solution. I think that what is hard about moving away from Heroku really boils down to you're giving up all of those opinions. You're gaining flexibility. You're often gaining significant price improvements. I mean, we've had customers, save over 50% if their bill was big enough. There's sometimes big, significant reasons to move away from Heroku, but it is scary. It is hard. You do have to bring a lot more expertise in-house. You can't just expose a dashboard to a bunch of developers and expect that they're able to figure it all out. Now, with the right tools, you can still enable your developers. You can still make a lot of this easy. You can make it a lot like a Heroku kind of experience, and we're going to get to some of that. But you need to have the right experience. And I want to be super clear, Kubernetes is so popular right now. If you go out and Google Kubernetes best practices, you'll find 150,000 articles with 160,000 different opinions. And it's really hard to sort through those and know where you really should be investing. And it's really hard to make sense out of the noise out there from a lot of people spin up a cluster, play with it on the weekend on a couple of Raspberry Pis, and then write a very strongly opinionated article about how to use it in production when they really have no clue at any kind of scale. And there are some unique problems in running it at scale. So let's move on to this next slide. Fairwinds runs Kubernetes clusters in all three clouds. The three major clouds, I should say. Some people will have a very strong opinion about me only calling them three clouds. The three significant clouds, and we do it usually on top of the managed Kubernetes platform. So there, Google has GKE, Amazon has EKS, Azure has AKS. There are reasons that we like to leverage those things. A significant part of why people paid us for Kubernetes expertise 3 years ago was that just standing up a Kubernetes cluster is really, really hard, or was really, really hard. It's really not anymore. Even I can go in and click a few buttons and get a Kubernetes cluster. It's what happens after that that's actually really difficult for most people now. But talk a little bit about the different cloud platforms, Lance. You can move from Heroku to Kubernetes on any different cloud platform. Is that right? I mean, they all have a managed thing. Is there a reason for one cloud over another right now?
There could be, but I think that those differences are going to be individual. There's varying support for different CNIs. If you're unfamiliar with Kubernetes, so CNI is effectively the networking layer that sits on top of a group of nodes in Kubernetes that sort of helps you like assign or maintain the IP per pod model, right? So a pod is a group of Docker containers that runs in Kubernetes. So different cloud providers support different CNIs. There's different cloud providers. One thing to consider about, when you move to Kubernetes, and we'll get a little bit more into this a little bit later in the discussion about, how realistic, how much closer does Kubernetes bring you to multi-cloud? But there's different clouds that offer different, backend services that you may have more opinions on than sort of where your workloads are run, where you're actually scheduling some of your processes that you're going to schedule into Kubernetes. So, various clouds have various different feature sets, support different things. They have different backing services that may be more or less important to you. I think a lot of times when people are, doing enough work in Heroku to where the bill does become an issue, and they start to say like, my cloud spend, my infrastructure spend is going to go somewhere. You can work with different cloud providers to negotiate better pricing, along with committing and projecting some growth. So there could be some incentives there depending on where you go. So there certainly are benefits here and there, but they're really case by case for the people moving.
Yeah, and really, I'll give a high-level opinion about some of that. So if just Kubernetes is the driving issue, there's a lot of things that GKE just does better. It's the most mature of the Kubernetes offerings, and moving to Google, you're going to have the easiest time with just base-level Kubernetes. Now, Google lags behind AWS in terms of all the features that AWS has, right? Sometimes people choose AWS because AWS literally has every feature in the world. Not all of your infrastructure is going to run inside of Kubernetes. Your data layer is probably not going to run inside of Kubernetes. There are customers that we have that do that. We generally encourage against it. Our philosophy is to keep everything in Kubernetes ephemeral all the way down to the cluster. But if you're not going to run everything in Kubernetes, there may be features outside of Kubernetes that the cloud offers that are important, and AWS is way out in the lead with that. Now, Azure has a couple things. There's a lot of people who are well embedded in the Microsoft ecosystem. There's reasons to stay on Azure. Also, AWS and Azure have some government approvals, depending on what kinds of customers you're meeting, that Google doesn't quite yet meet. So there's variation there. But the short of this is, and Lance said very diplomatically, you can do it on any cloud platform. There are reasons to do it on one versus the other, but they tend to be company specific. Now that said, Lance, say I pull off a successful migration onto Kubernetes and I move to Google. Now I'm in Kubernetes. I can be truly cloud agnostic, right? I mean, this is a thing that a lot of people say. I want to move to Kubernetes because then I can move to any cloud I want. And if Amazon offers me a better deal next month, I'll just flip a switch and move my clusters over. How much of a reality is that?
Sure. Yeah, but before we go into the euphoric land of cloud agnosticism, one thing about the cloud provider choice that I think is important to mention, especially in the context of Heroku, is one feature that Heroku introduced at some point in their lifespan was the ability to peer VPCs. So Heroku runs on top of Amazon, and then you sort of get the premium service of having this PaaS that they've used to orchestrate how you get resources provisioned. But the back end of Heroku is Amazon, and they give you the opportunity to peer other Amazon resources with what you have in Heroku, so you can expand your cloud footprint not just in Heroku but also in your own AWS account. So that may be a driving factor in choosing
Sure.
how you do things. If you have other resources running in AWS and you decide that you're going to migrate off of Heroku and go over to GCP, you're introducing a layer of complexity of how you're going to continue to peer resources and utilize the other resource that you have in Amazon, or you're going to have to elect to migrate some of that stuff over as well, whether it's just standalone compute instances or some of the service offerings that AWS has. So.
That's an important point. Yeah. And
yeah.
It is a Salesforce product, but it does run on top of AWS. It
does run on top of AWS. That's correct. But I think that segues really well into this idea of cloud agnosticism, right? When Kubernetes is becoming a standard tool for scheduling workloads, in most infrastructure, right? And that's why you're seeing managed service like GKE, EKS, AKS start to pop up around Kubernetes. All cloud providers want to have this managed Kubernetes offering. However, you mentioned state and workloads in Kubernetes. Kubernetes does have this idea of a stateful set, where you can effectively have pods appear to be ephemeral but still hold state behind them. That in our deep experience in Kubernetes here at Fairwinds is not necessarily as straightforward as it sounds. Anytime somebody comes to me and says, I want to run my Postgres database in Kubernetes for reason, right? Like cost savings. No matter where you run your Postgres database, you're still going to be utilizing the same amount of resource in terms of, what it takes to actually back your application in most cases. And when you start to deal with stateful services and ephemerality, where things are coming and going and having to reattach to block storage when it comes back up, you're introducing a lot of complexity there and a lot of ways that things can go wrong. And, when you have state as part of your application stack, which almost almost all application stacks do, those tend to be things that need to be really, really reliable. So introducing complexity and introducing the need to deal with being ephemeral is typically not a risk that most folks want to take when we start to talk about some of the nuance there and give them the choice of assuming what is a tremendous amount of risk with state in their applications. So with that said, where do you put your state, right? So state generally ends up in another service in your cloud provider, S3, RDS, Elasticache, things like that. And so when you start to leverage all these other services, and then you supplement that with putting all of your workloads in Kubernetes, you can certainly move workloads to different Kubernetes clusters, right? Like you take whatever, one of the nice things about Kube is it's declaratively driven, right? Which is different than Heroku. Heroku is very imperative. You get in, you click around, and if you needed to recreate that work for any reason, you have to maybe go find the engineer who clicked around and set everything up, and perhaps they can remember exactly what they did and give you something that loosely resembles the first thing that they built that you need another one of, right? In Kubernetes, it's very imperatively driven, declaratively driven. So everything is defined in YAML, and you take these YAML files that have definitions of how things are supposed to look in your Kubernetes cluster, and you push that to the API. The API comes back and says, great, I'm going to try and make that so. You can certainly do that against a new Kubernetes cluster, but when you talk about the surrounding services, the state, everything else you have running in your cloud provider, that's where it gets really complicated to be able to say, oh, and move several petabytes of object storage over to a new cloud. That stuff like that is very hard to do.
Or you can just have your database running in a different cloud and have incredible latency. There's a lot, yeah. I mean, the other piece of this is if your infrastructure is running inside of Kubernetes, a move to another Kubernetes environment will be easier, will be faster, but it is definitely not cloud agnostic. You definitely don't have a script where you click a button and it jumps to a different cloud with no downtime. And we want to be clear about that. So now I do want to be clear, we do aim to wrap up by about 45 minutes past the hour, so we got about 15 more minutes. Lance and I will try to talk fast, get through the rest of this, but we want to leave some time for questions. So just so everyone understands the schedule, that's what we're aiming for. Next, what should I look out for when making a similar move? Lance, what kinds of things have companies struggled with in a migration from Heroku to Kubernetes? What are the problems they've dealt with? And is the ops overhead in the move worth it?
Sure. I think that we mentioned earlier the learning curve of being able to come out of something that's highly opinionated, and then all of a sudden you're faced with you go from this place where you're in this highly opinionated environment, and most choices are made for you, and then you run into one and you say, well, I don't like that choice, I need to figure out how to make more choices myself, and then all of a sudden all the choices are not made for you and you have to make them all at once. So there can be a significant learning curve there. That is typically where we come in as Kubernetes experts, where we're helping people get potentially off of a PaaS or get off of just running workloads in compute instances in the cloud to being able to do something where they're able to slice up resource a little bit better utilization and better spend. So yeah, I mean, there are a lot of choices to make when you move into Kubernetes, and especially out of Heroku, it's a big cliff to fall off. And that's typically why people come to us, is because they say, here are the things that are important to us. Can you please make the right choices for us? Because it's going to take, like you said, Kendall, a fleet of engineers and potentially a year plus to be able to sort all of that out. So there's a bit of that. I typically find folks struggling a little bit with how to deal with their networking layers, their proxy layers. Networking and figuring out how do I route traffic and where does it go, and how do I manage live connections during release and those sorts of things. Heroku provides a lot of opinion around that and a lot of sort of happy paths to those sorts of things, and that becomes a little bit more complex when you get into Kubernetes. There are certainly solutions for that, and again, things that we help folks out with all the time, but it's certainly a different paradigm than the highly opinionated world of Heroku. Sort of the other common problem is learning, well, hey, in Heroku I manage configs via this UI. How do I manage configs in Kubernetes? Another part, bit of Heroku is a challenge of coming out of Heroku is, how do I manage shipping my application? In Heroku, I just make a git commit, and then Heroku does some things, and I'm serving a new version of my app, right? Like my code changes are live. How does that change when you go to Kubernetes? You have to start talking about bringing in a CI/CD system. You have to start talking about like, well, I need to build Docker containers and publish those as artifacts and be able to ship those. So there's some work to assume there in order to be able to take your app that just runs from a git commit in Heroku to being able to have shippable artifacts and be able to run in Kubernetes.
But that's so what you just said, Lance, is scary to a lot of companies. Most people in Heroku are never SSHing into anything, fiddling with config files, they are clicking buttons and it's easy, and it feels easy, and it feels safe because there's the limitations of what the buttons provide. But the average developer is interacting with it through a git commit. How does Fairwinds get engineers to have a similar deployment experience? Like, just at a high level, what are the things that are pieced together so that an application is deployed into Kubernetes with relative ease for a developer?
Sure. Yeah. So, we have a number of CI/CD systems that we work with when we engage with companies, and we really help to lay down good framework and CI/CD pipelines that will, help developers understand, like, here, because process, especially around release and lifecycle management of applications, is key for developers, right? Because what the last thing that they want to do is be able to push code and be responsible for an outage potentially at the place that they work. And so the safety around that and the process around that, and really understanding what happens when I do want to create a release and push it into an environment. So yeah, we do a lot of work around CI/CD platforms, things like CircleCI, GitLab CI, where we create frameworks for folks to be able to manage application lifecycle, push things downstream. We have an open source tool. If you go to github.com/fairwindsops, we have a bunch of open source stuff there, but one of them is called Rocket Scripts. It's just a series of bash scripts that we use to kind of wrap our opinions around how to make it easier to manage different stages of build and deploy pipelines. So, really we help people understand, how do you translate your process into this new environment?
Yeah. Okay. And so you talked, I asked you a little question about how do we make that smooth. Is Kubernetes a PaaS builder? Am I full of it when I say that you can use it to go build a PaaS that's customizable for your needs? You can be honest, Lance. You can say I'm full of it in this.
I feel like we could do one webinar unpacking that Kelsey Hightower quote because there really is a lot there. I think that people do come to Kubernetes with a lot of opinions of how they want things to look. And there is a premium in cost on Heroku because of the features that it gives you in terms of a PaaS. We haven't really talked about the review app or sort of feature-based ephemeral type environments that Heroku offers, where they'll actually drive building out stateful backends and stuff for your for your applications to kind of help some parallel development velocity with developer groups. So I think that anybody could potentially build a PaaS on Kubernetes. You can schedule any type of workload there that you want to. There's some that fit the bill for Kubernetes a lot better than others. And like you said, Kendall, I think that there's a lot of times that people come to us and they say, hey, Kubernetes is the buzzword of the day. I want my things in Kubernetes, and we can talk to them for 15 minutes and see that what they're running may not be the best fit for Kubernetes, whether it be a cost or type of workload sort of thing. So yeah, you can certainly get some of the features of a PaaS on Kubernetes, but you're probably it's probably not worth the effort that it would take for an engineering team to fully build out, a similar PaaS on Heroku, or a similar PaaS on Kubernetes. As
walled of a garden as other places. Yeah. And then talk about the things that, if you're running an application in Heroku, you've bought into their walled garden, right, Lance?
Yep.
And so that means your application already fits certain patterns. Are there things about that that are going to make it a better fit for Kubernetes than, say, I have an application running on my server in my back room and I haven't turned off my server in 14 years? Just talk briefly about that. What are the opinions that I've already bought into that are going to make Kubernetes adoption easier?
Yeah. Before we move on, we had one question from Nedco brings up, why would you want to build a PaaS on Kubernetes? It's an economy of scale, and yeah, that's a perfect point, right? Like there are certain features to support your developer workflow that you may meet with add-ons in your cluster, but yeah, you wouldn't want to build a full-blown PaaS on Kubernetes. I mean, you would, especially since you're running it yourself. Ideally, you're going to want to stop at the needs of your organization, right? You're not going to and I think that a lot of times when people come to us and they say, well, why don't you do these things with Kubernetes? And the closer you creep to a PaaS, then, you're not really managing K8s, you're managing a PaaS, and then you should just be a PaaS provider and not, be Kubernetes consultants. So yeah, but as far as so you're running things on your 14-year-old server. It's great. It has an uptime of 6 years, and why would you want to touch that? You have your little altar where you're burning incense and praying that it doesn't go down every night before you go to sleep. Again, there's some reliability bits there. One thing that Kubernetes offers that's really nice is you have this idea of, replicas of a single service. So there's some architectural nuance there that you have to meet with the way that your applications or workloads run, but you are able to run many replicas of, many copies of your code, and that creates some level of reliability, because if one dies, if one goes away, Kubernetes will automatically reschedule another instance of that workload, right? Like at its core, Kubernetes is a scheduling platform. You say, hey, I need this many instances of my app to be running, and it will go figure out where to run it. And if it can't run it because you don't have enough resource or something, for example, then it will come back and tell you like, hey, there's no place to put this. Either you need to give me more resource in the cluster, or you need to, understand better what's available and adapt your requirements accordingly. The other piece is this idea of bin packing, right? So, I would be curious what the server in your closet has for utilization right now. Are you running at full CPU capacity? Or are you running at 10% of your CPU? What's your memory consumption like? What happens when you decide, hey, I have a new feature that I need to build into my product. I'm going to build a microservice for that. Where do you put that? Do you run it on the same server? Do you have to expand to a second server and then run your new your new microservice on that? Kubernetes answers some of those questions for you, because you're able to say, hey, I want to schedule, this new service out here in my Kubernetes cluster. Where does it go? You can set resource requirements in terms of things like memory and CPU at the process level, at the workload level. That will get replicated along with the instances of your app that you're running. And, then you're able to say, hey, from a node standpoint, I have all these different services bin packed into a node that's part of my cluster. I want to scale out to 10 nodes in GKE, for example, and that's my ceiling. And then I need to have a conversation, because my cloud spend is going to get too high. Is it worth it to, scale out to 20 because, we can afford it because, we're making money hand over fist? Or do I need to talk about resource utilization with developers and how efficient the code is, and try to bring that back down? So you can it pushes some of those conversations to the forefront, which I think are a lot more difficult to have when you're just running things directly on hardware or even directly on cloud compute instances.
Yeah. Okay, we got 5 minutes to get through 2 more questions. So your answers, I think, are pretty interesting to people, Lance, but you got to talk faster.
Are you telling me to talk less?
No, faster. I want you to say the same amount of words now.
Okay.
So let's go over to high level. How does Fairwinds migrate folks to Kubernetes off of Heroku? Whoops. Let me go back here. Oh, come on. Tools. Here we go. So say, I'm a company on Heroku, and I've mostly been able to leverage my team with an almost no ops mindset on Heroku. We have software developers, and then one guy that understands a little bit about Heroku. Kubernetes is intimidating. Set my mind at ease. What are the kinds of things that we would do to make this relatively lightweight?
Sure. I mean, so we talked about process earlier, and how, how important processes and application lifecycle management is to developers. That is your code. It's what drives your company. You need to feel comfortable pushing that into an environment where it's going to, be serving production traffic. And we come in and we help you establish those practices that you need to be able to do that. We come in, one of the very first parts of an engagement with Fairwinds is we come in and we do some due diligence against what you currently have running, and we present you with a report and a project plan of like, okay, how does what you're doing, whether it be in Heroku or somewhere else, fit into running in Kubernetes? And so we help give you a, like, hey, here are the places where it translates, here how things are going to be different. And then we help you set down some of those best practices about how you approach Kubernetes. How do you set up your CI/CD pipelines? What does delivery look like? How do I manage config? How do I automate getting SSL certificates for something new that I want to spin up? How do I, automate different types of routing, that goes to different types of my application?
Yeah, and then I mean, I would add that the migration process looks, as we mentioned at the beginning of this, we see a lot of companies that go out and hire a number of engineers and hope that in 6 months they have a few services up and running in Kubernetes. One of the things that sets us apart, and this is going to be a little bit of the sales pitch in here, but hang in there, there's more content coming. But we have a tremendous amount of automation around how to build production-ready Kubernetes. So it's we can, in a couple of lines of code, generate a significant percentage of a production-ready infrastructure as code setup. Now, it's going to need to be tweaked to meet a customer's needs. It's going to need to, have workloads migrated into it. So rather than 6 months to a year of finally getting stuff up and running, we're usually, less than a couple of weeks before the infrastructure is built. And then it's a couple of weeks after that before your first applications are deployed into it. Now, some of that depends on how simple your application is, how easy it is to containerize, if it's already containerized, how, what you want for a deployment process, et cetera. We do tweak things along all of those lines, but we have a number of customers up and running with at least some of their workloads in production in Kubernetes within 4 to 6 weeks. And often, we have patterns in place to make the rest of that migration much, much faster than it would be elsewhere. Is that an appropriate timeline, Lance, before I move on to the next thing? Am I accurate with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, most of that data is based on, we have a lot of experience of moving people from a lot of platforms into Kubernetes, and, a lot of experience managing Kubernetes clusters ongoing. I mean, I think that we have clusters that we've been managing for clients for over 2 years now, which, is a pretty early adoption of Kube as a platform. And so that's based on some historical data, and, you may see some variance there. If your development practice is really really tight and very clean, you could see times shorter than that. I think for us, if you have a lot of splay in what you're doing, and maybe you're running a huge monorepo that that has 50 different lines in a proc file in Heroku, and so you're starting up 50 different instances of the same code base, there's going to be a little bit more to pick apart there, I think. So yeah.
But there's the simple of this is we are running production environments for lots and lots of customers at scale. We, as a company, our secret sauce is packaging that up, delivering it for an affordable price, often comparable with one internal hire. And we make that profitable for ourselves by having a tremendous amount of it automated in a useful way. And to be clear, this is vanilla Kubernetes best practices in automation, not a proprietary anything. So our last question, and we'll go quick. Also, feel free right now at the bottom of your screen in Zoom, you should see, there's a mute, stop video. There should be a QA button, and you should be able to bring that up and punch questions in there. You can type it into the chat, as Nedco did earlier, but if you want to dump questions in there while we finish up this last thing, we can spend the last few minutes answering those questions. But so we've talked a little bit about this. How do we have the same great experience? Will there be downtime? Where will my data go? Will my costs increase? How much knowledge does my team need in order to make this migration? And yeah, all of the questions, Lance, go for it.
Yeah. I think as far as the experience with Heroku, things are going to shift certainly. But again, I think that there is a workflow for delivery into Kubernetes, much like there is with Heroku, albeit different. And I think that, with the help of people who have some great opinions around that, who are able to, talk to you about what your needs are, people like Fairwinds talk to you about what your needs are around delivering and running workloads, you'll be able to see a process that I think makes sense. And in my experience has made developers a lot happier because they do have the option to, select which choices they want to make and things that they really care about running in a way that they're opinionated on. And not just having to adopt the wholesale opinions of a PaaS. Will there be downtime in the migration? Anytime you're starting to serve traffic from a different place and a different platform, there's a lot of complexities there. We typically do DNS cutovers, like, for the holy grail moment when we're, taking somebody out of Heroku or out of a, whatever platform they're running in, and in Kubernetes, we'll just, set a DNS record to point at the kube cluster serving traffic. So, there's a lot of testing and careful thought that goes into that. So there is a high potential for a no downtime cutover. It's certainly not going to be the days of old when you have a 12-hour maintenance window overnight, and you put up the maintenance page served by your CDN to let everybody know that they can come back tomorrow. So we typically see at best like a small blip, less than 60 seconds of potential downtime, but for the most part, it's a very seamless transition, potentially zero downtime. Where will your data go? Really depends on where your data is now. Potentially if you're hosting stuff in like RDS and in Amazon, it could potentially stay in the same place, and you just fire up Kubernetes and you start scheduling your app to run in Kube rather than Heroku, and your data stays in the same place. If you're switching cloud providers, again, cloud agnosticism is not necessarily as easy as a switch flip, as Kendall alluded to earlier. So there's going to be some complexity there, but in many cases, your data could stay in the same place. Will your costs increase? Likely not. Of course, you never want to make any guarantees around cost and spend, but 99.9% of the time, you will see a cost decrease in moving off of Heroku. If you're past that inflection point that we talked about earlier, again, if you're very early stage and you're not running, you're not doing a tremendous amount of stuff, then you're probably not going to see, with the overhead of running an entire Kubernetes cluster, like you're not going to see a cost increase versus running like one instance of a dev app in Heroku. But when you do hit that inflection point, there is a potential for cost savings. There are high potential for cost savings.
Well, and I would add that where the cost increases, where the complexity increases. So if you need to hire someone like Fairwinds, if you're spending $50,000 a month in Heroku, hiring us and moving off of Heroku, you might see a dead even or even cost savings above and beyond that. If you're spending $10,000 a month in Heroku and you need to hire someone like us, your cost is probably going to go up. So like, what does it take in order to see cost savings? You have to also count in what is it going to take for the additional complexity. And we have 5 questions here, Lance. So answer this last one briefly.
Yeah, how much knowledge? I mean, I think that, we bring a lot of knowledge. Our typical engagement, we have an open Slack channel. So like your company would have a Slack channel where you have access to something like 3 to 5 engineers to answer ad hoc questions. But, there is, the objects that live in Kubernetes are key to, how your applications run, how deploys are handled, how config is handled. And so I think that there is, it's a different platform, it's different paradigms. There is a lot to learn there, but having a solid backstop of people with deep knowledge of the platform is key. And we've seen a lot of people have a lot of success partnering with us and getting away from where they are in Kubernetes.
Yep. So I'm going to dive into answering some of these questions here. The first question. I don't want to be put into a situation with vendor lock-in and 100% reliance on your team. What do you do to help us prepare for life with Kubernetes after Fairwinds? So there's a lot here. First of all, part of our pitch is there's nothing about what we're going to build for you that's different than if you found 5 highly qualified, very experienced people who know Kubernetes to come in and build the infrastructure for you. What's different is we're going to do it faster because of our existing automation. We're going to do it well enough that you're going to want to stay with us because our service is quality. We very much have a we want to teach you to fish mentality, and some customers really want to learn and understand all of it. And usually they retain us for the long term because they enjoy having us as a backstop, not because they feel locked into what we've built for them. We will give you nothing that will be locked in. You will have access to your infrastructure repo if you leave. We don't ship it to, Ukraine or something and tell you can never have it back.
But Kendall, what's an infrastructure repo?
So, good point. You're going to want we build everything with infrastructure as code. So your entire infrastructure will be put together as code. If for some reason you had something absolutely horrible happen and you had to rebuild everything from scratch, the infrastructure is entirely documented as code and can be stood back up. Now you have to deploy all your things back into it, but that is, something that most companies want and not every company gets to.
Yep. And so with that, we use all open source tooling to build everything that we build out for our clients. And so if at any point, people decide that they're at a point where they want to hire their own folks, we have a code base that we can package and hand off to folks. So there's nothing proprietary that we use currently at Fairwinds that we can't just hand over to folks with the right knowledge and skill set, and they can run it on their own.
Yep. So I'm going to mark that one done. Kevin just asked a follow-up question to that. After completing the migration, what continued maintenance services do you provide? So Fairwinds, our core offering, is a ongoing managed service. We are different from most consultancies. We do not build a thing and say, good luck, hope you don't screw it all up. We build and then we maintain, and we provide 24/7 pager on the infrastructure that we've built for clients. So that's a normal part of our cost. And again, our packages are set to be comparable to an internal hire, depending on what market you're in. That may or may not be the case. Our prices are always going up as there's demand, but that tends to be where we fit. That's a yearly price with a year-long service. So wait, I had to say answer live and done. Next question, are there any trials or ways for me to try out Kubernetes so that I can decide if it's the right move? And Lance, I'll answer this and you can tell me what you think, but I think the short of this is it's really hard to go in and kick the tires on something as complex as Kubernetes. What you can do is go in and click a couple buttons in one of the cloud provider Kubernetes systems, spin up a Kubernetes cluster, kick the tires, see what you like about it, what you don't, deploy something sample into it and kick it around, but it's pretty difficult to relate that to a full-fledged production environment that your whole team's going to interact with. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Lance.
Yeah, and I would be remiss if I didn't evangelize our own kind of how-to tutorials that we've made here at Fairwinds that are out there in the wild. You can find them on YouTube. I'm sure everybody had to sacrifice an email address to get into this webinar, and potentially we can talk with the marketing folks about pointing you all in that direction. But we do have some kind of 101 how to get started in Kubernetes tutorials out there. There is some cost for, like, GKE, for example. You get a bunch of credits if you sign up with a new email, something like $300 worth. So you can certainly make it through a 101 tutorial, which we have we provided here at Fairwinds that are open to the community, and get into something like GKE. Just click through the cluster creation process and then kind of start messing around with the API and deploying some Kubernetes objects. We have an open source repository called Kate's Workshop on our GitHub page. Again, github.com/fairwindsops, and you can go there, and it's a step-by-step tutorial of how to run like a 2-tiered Ruby application to Kubernetes. So you're running Redis on the back end, and like I think a Rails server or something like that on the front end. And you can kind of mess around with that. You can look at things like config maps, secrets, network constructs, services, and deployments.
Yep. Another follow-up question from earlier, what infrastructure as code tooling will you be using? And as part of the engagement, will we own the infrastructure as code source? The answer is yes, you will own that source. We will give you, it's in a repo. We tend to maintain ownership of that repo until you leave, and then we turn that over to you. Is that correct, Lance? You always have access to it, but we like to maintain control over, if we're running Pager, we don't want you pushing things to the infrastructure code repo that wake us up in the middle of the night, but you get that when you leave.
Correct. Yeah. So we do keep it in our GitHub org until clients terminate service with us. And again, that is just like you said, Kendall, like, if I'm on call, which I am right now, unfortunately didn't get paged during this webinar. But yeah, if there's things that we get woken up in the middle of the night for, we'd like to be gatekeepers. We are very transparent about the work that we do. So like any number of collaborators from a company's org can be added to that infrastructure as code repository. But we do like to be gatekeepers for change if it's things that we're going to be responsible for keeping up 24/7.
Yep. And we're coming up on time here. We're going to keep answering questions. If you've asked a question, we will get to them. We've got 4 more. If you have a hard stop, we are recording this, and I believe David will be sending it out to everyone. So if you have to stop, if you have a hard stop, feel free to drop. Next question, you addressed this a bit when talking about shipping artifacts. How might developer interaction look when deploying and troubleshooting in Kubernetes instead of Heroku?
Yeah, sure. So this really kind of digs into the topic about, one of the questions that Kendall had, which was, what am I going to have to learn when I switch to Kubernetes? And, again, it's a different ecosystem. And so there's ways to get at all the same information that you have in Heroku and really more information than you have in Heroku. You just have to understand the Kubernetes API a little bit to access that. So, like if you fire up a deployment and for some reasons it's not starting, you can use, so Kubernetes deployments or a wrapper around this idea of pods, and a pod is like one scheduled instance of a workload, and you can use a verb called describe against the pod object, and you can see Kubernetes streams events that happen across the platform, and it will give you sort of the last sequence of events that are related to that pod, and it will typically give you information like, I couldn't find a config map that I was supposed to have as this pod definition, or I failed a liveness probe, the app inside of this pod didn't come up the way that I expected it to, that you said for me to check to make sure that it's like healthy and reliable and ready to actually serve traffic. So you can use describe. There's a kube control is the CLI tool for interacting with the Kubernetes API. There's a kube control logs, so you can tail logs live in any of the containers that are running inside of a pod. So there's ways to get at all the information. When we typically set up clusters for folks, we talk to them about where they want their logs shipped. If they're using something like Sumo or Datadog for logs, and we set that up so we can kind of help you figure out where to look at your logs there. So there's ways to get at the information. We certainly help people understand those. That's part of the education that we provide. But yeah, it's similar, if not greater than Heroku. You just have to figure out how to access it.
Yep. Next question, when you provide migration automation, how do you handle different flavors and architecture of how we want our K8s cluster namespaces, ingress customizations, RBAC integrations, workflow engine, etc.? Do we provide deployment descriptors?
Sure. And I think in a lot of cases, for us, managing life cycle of a lot of those application and workload specific objects is not something that we really want to do long term as part of our engagement. Managing and maintaining the Kubernetes clusters themselves and their add-ons is really where we feel is like a good demarcation point for both us and the clients that we have. So we can provide a lot of advisement on how do you best run those things in Kubernetes, but I think ultimately, when we do things like set up deploys, we have a structure of definition kind of ways to manage workflow that comes along with the Rocket Scripts tool that I talked about earlier, where you have a deploy directory in the root of your project repo, and it has definitions for what different environments should look like specific to that application. That includes things like Helm charts, that includes things like ingress definitions. So, part of what we do when we assess a company who wants to move off of whatever platform they're on and into Kubernetes is we talk about a lot of those needs. What does routing look like for your application, various parts if you're doing microservices? Maybe you're using path-based routing somewhere, and how do you set that up? We typically use the Nginx ingress controller, for example, and you can just use Kubernetes ingress objects to set up all of that complexity and have it again declaratively defined in values files if you're using Helm, or just Kubernetes YAML that you can version in places like GitHub. So a lot of that stuff is very specific, but we do help people set up the right patterns around that, and then provide a backstop and knowledge for you to be able to manage, tweak, and make changes for that.
Yep. How has the evolution, volatility of the K8s framework been in your experience? Were we to migrate today, how relevant would our config and setup be in 1, 2, and 5 years?
Not, and again, I'm an engineer, and so I despise sales pitches as much as the next engineer. But that's really our value proposition for ongoing management of K8s. We hear a lot of people come to us and they say, well, GKE is a managed service. What do I need you for? And that is very true until one of the upcoming versions of Kubernetes 1.16 deprecates a lot of APIs. And, a lot of people are like, well, what do I do with my objects, when an API is deprecated in Kubernetes? How do I change that? What happens? What happens when there's a security patch? How do I monitor for security patches in Kubernetes? So there is constant change, despite being around now for 3 some odd years as something viable that people are actually starting to adopt. It is still a rapidly changing and somewhat volatile ecosystem. And that's really our value proposition, is we assume that for clients, so you don't have to, and you can focus on, doing the things that are important to you, which is, your product, and, trying to run it on, the smallest cloud footprint that you can, and, still be able to scale and be viable.
Yep. Do you provide training on your scripts, open source tools, so that third parties can use them to build for their own clients? I mean, the short of this, Rajiv, is no. If you wanted a bunch of training on our open source tooling and we're willing to pay a lot of money for that, we would probably find a way. Money can usually turn a no to a yes. Our open source tools are open source, and we do intend to share them with everyone, including people who might use it to go build their own practice around this. But it's not something we're typically in the habit of training other people on. Now, that said, we do have a tool right now called Fairwinds Insights that is in free beta right now, or open beta, I should say. It's going to be a paid tool in the near future, but we have seen some consultancies take that, run that against client architectures, and come away with a whole bunch of low-hanging fruit for things that can be improved upon. So that's something that you could use if you have your own practice. Finally, how have you handled local development patterns using Kubernetes?
That's a very challenging question. We typically don't. There are like local Kubernetes emulators that you can run, various flavors. I'm drawing a blank on the name of the most popular one right now. But yeah, there are local Kubernetes emulators that you can run via like VirtualBox, for example. Well, that's what it uses under the hood, but you don't actually have to interact with VirtualBox like on an OS X desktop or anything like that. For local dev, I think that typically, as far as viability of what you're trying to push, in Kubernetes configuration, we handle. We typically do things just through linting before you actually get to the build and deploy process.
Okay. So that's what we have for questions. I want to say thanks to everyone for coming. This has been the migrating from Heroku to Kubernetes. If you want to know more, please reach out to our sales team. I'm sure our marketing team will be in touch, but we are happy to talk about all the things and make this very scary transition not scary for you. So
there was one more question that came in. I think I missed the info about the infrastructure as code framework that you all recommend. Pared down very quickly, since we're at the end of our time, Terraform and Helm. is what we use for infrastructure as code at this point.
Yeah, we're not adopting a third-party infrastructure as code framework. We have a framework for building out infrastructure as code with those tools. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Yep.
Have a great day.